if you know the butler did it, the movie isn't as neat the second time. If you know the punchline to the joke, the comedian isn't as funny the second. And so one of the things we pitched real hard was the idea that if we built interactive, quote unquote, movies, they wouldn't age out nearly so quickly. And that has turned out to be a pretty good prediction.
That is Imagineer Joe Garlington, and you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Hey there, thanks for joining me here on episode 235 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. Really excited about today's show with Joe Garlington, where he talks about his work at Imagineering. He actually joined Disney during the construction of Epcot. That timing also worked on the Tron Arcade, which never came to fruition at that park, and then returned later and worked on a lot of interactive attractions. You heard him mention that in the intro. Worked on Turtle Talk with Crush, Monsters, Inc., Laugh Floor, DisneyQuest, Test Track 2.0, so much more. I really enjoyed talking to Joe just about how much went into that, especially with Turtle Talk, just how inventive that was for the time and how that really impacted the future of the Seas Pavilion. Lots of great stuff from Joe, so let's get right to it. Here is Joe Garlington. You've worked on a lot of cool attractions, especially interactive ones, which I find really interesting, just how that's kind of evolved from some of the early ones. But I'd love to ask you first, just kind of when you were growing up, how did you get interested even in becoming an artist or working in that zone as you were, growing up?
Yeah, so my father was a college English professor and young and untenured at the time. So every summer he would run out of work and have to find a college program someplace else. And so every summer, he'd uproot the family. We'd go to some other town for the summer. Most children meet their friends in school. So it meant every summer I didn't have anybody to play with except my sister. And so we did a lot of reading, a lot of game playing, and a lot of art making that you could do in a sort of a solitary way. And so that probably is the instigation for that. Then when I got into college, I first tried history and tried anthropology, and neither of those worked. So finally I settled in on it.
Well, I know you, like you mentioned, you went to college for conceptual art and sculpture. I believe you went to Cal Arts for undergrad, but were you thinking much about like what you wanted to do as a career then, or even looking towards, where you ended up?
No, not at all. My undergrad was at the University of Utah.
Okay.
That's when I started making interactive art. One day I was reading this article in a magazine called Art Forum, which was the Bible for all us art students back in the day. And there was an article about how art had become too precious and it should be much more touchable. And they talked about Henry Moore sculptures and Frank Stella sculptures as being robust and could be touched and stuff like that. Well, that's a little bit of baloney. They didn't make them to make them touchable. They made them just because they wanted them. Those are the materials they like working with. And I thought, but if touchable art is the next movement in art, I've already missed that boat. So what would be the boat after that? I thought, well, it'd be art that touches back. And so I began to make what turned out to be interactive work, because it was work that wanted guests to interact with it over time. I got frustrated with the static nature of the plastic arts in those days.
Well, that's interesting. Ultimately, given where you ended up further down in your career, but I'm curious, you ended up joining Disney, fairly early on at an interesting time. I mean, as far as Epcot and when that was being created. So how did that come about where you ended up joining Disney, and what kind of interested you about it?
I started out, so I undergraduate at U, and then I got into California Institute of the Arts. And while I was there, I developed a friendship with a guy named Bill Novi. Bill was a technically oriented guy. He was studying theater technologies. He had undergraduate degrees, bachelor's in mechanical and bachelor's in electronic engineering. I was by then beginning to, because I was trying to make interactive art, I kept needing somebody to help me figure out how to make motors turn around in circles and all, kind of the basic stuff. How does a switch work, Bill? And he was generous enough to help me with that stuff. So soon he, my wife, and I brought them into my studio, and the three of us worked together. Bill had wanted to be at Disney from age 8 when he'd gone there to head special effects. He got an internship that summer between our 2 years of master's school at WDI. The day he graduated, they made him head of special effects at WDI. And so then he started trying to get me to come in. And I went into the film industry for a little while, worked on a bunch of movies. And then there was a writer's strike, reminiscence of something that happened recently. And out of work, I ended up, Bill said, well, we're working over here. I was like, well, okay, let me join you. And so I did a 10-week job there, designed the load unload area for Spaceship Earth. That's still there. And then went away, worked on some movies, and then came back. Marty called me to come back and work on what was called the Sperry Show at the time. It opened as the Astuter Computer Review. And I did Video Peppers Ghost for that, among other things. And then wasn't enjoying that project. Got tangled up with another designer. And at the time, Barry Braverman was just finishing off the ImageWorks section, which had hit as an interactive thing. And he asked me if I wanted to work with him on something themed to Tron. And so we worked on something that originally was called Game Grid, later Tron Arcade, which was to have gone in Innoventions. It never opened. The closest we got was one poster in the hallway. But we spent a bunch of money, developed 7 really big, interesting games. And that kind of got me just completely hooked into interactivity, and interactivity in a theme park kind of way, as opposed to games on a screen.
Oh, yeah, that Tron Arcade is one that people still kind of look back at and go, oh, that would have, what is the alternate universe where that would have come in, and then who knows what would have happened from there at Epcot? It's such an interesting...
Oh, I'd have been a god,
Yeah. You did okay, but yeah, it's interesting because, again, it kind of veered a little bit away from what Epcot was in those early years, but in an interesting way. And people love, I remember playing the arcade game of Tron. It was so cool at the time. Not in 82, but, a few years after. So who knows? That would have been really cool.
The closest we came was later when we did DisneyQuest. We used the same optic system as one of the games for Alien Encounter. The Infinity Optics display we'd originally invented for Tron Arcade. Later we rebuilt it for Alien Encounter.
So I know there's a bunch of things that happened from the early 80s to 90s. You started your own company and then left for a while and then ultimately returned. So I'm curious just to know a little bit about how that worked, where you ended up, leaving, and then ultimately what led you back to Imagineering in the early 90s.
Sure. So I worked, like I say, on Tron Arcade, and then the Storming the Magic Kingdom years started, right, when the takeover attempts started. And we went through a year where there were layoffs every Friday. I made a list. I played my own game. I made a list of all the people in the department and the order that I guessed they would be laid off in. And I was really good at that game.
I don't know what that says.
Yeah, I don't know. But when I saw my name, I knew that if there was going to be another one, I'd be on it. So I went in and I played a little trick on Barry. I said, so now when I am laid off on Friday, how does that work? And Barry went, and then he went, oh, I wasn't supposed to tell you. Well, but he had. So I went out and got myself a job. And so I was pleased with myself, because I went back in the film world, got paid for, 2 weeks of severance, and got paid to make movies. And so I was double paid for 2 weeks. And I thought I was so smart. At any rate. So then I worked on movies for a couple of weeks. I was working on The Natural. I was working for Apogee at the time, and on a silent stage, on a special effects stage. There's a scene in that movie where they set off a whole bunch of squibs. Robert Redford hits a long ball and it gets tangled up in the light standard. So I was sitting under that. I hadn't built it, but I was for whatever reason, I was the guy going click, 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 triggering the squibs. The director going, now, now, now. and and there were sparks flying all over the place and showering me and stuff like that. And I remember having this thought. For some people, this would be the most exciting thing in the world. There was a time when I would have thought this was the most exciting thing in the world, but I'm bored. And in the meantime, I had met a guy named Jay Stein who had Smith Engineering. They had done Vectrex, a very old game engine, and he was making games for people. And so I called Jay, and he hired me. And the only published games I ever did were videotape games for that. But that yanked me out. So I started freelance consulting, and then very quickly discovered I was actually a pretty good salesperson. And so I got a bunch of jobs, eventually got a job with New Mexico Museum of Natural History to do a walk through Volcano for them. And that built into several $1 million worth of work over the years. And that launched my company. And so we did that with Bill Novi as my partner, and my wife, and Shauna and his wife, Jody. And we worked part-time in the theme park industry, did a lot of work for Universal, for instance, and part-time in the museum industry. What we told ourselves is we're using the same equipment. If we power it by machine, then it's called special effects. And if we have guests do it, we call it interactivity. And so and we differentiated our offerings from other people's in that way. And there was a lot of practical stuff, a lot of mechanical stuff. A fair number of people were beginning to make computer games, and we didn't think we were particularly special in that area. So we began to use, like I say, a lot of practical stuff that guests would trigger and make a different kind of interactivity that seemed to sell well, particularly to the more conservative environment that zoos and museums were.
Yeah, I remember even being amazed at like our local science center around that time when you could press a button and something would happen. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is something I've never seen before. But all that seemed to lead really well into the work you ended up doing at Imagineering. So it sounded like you're doing very well with your own business. How did you end up ultimately then returning to Imagineering during the big Disney decade, basically, time?
Right. Yeah. My partners and I began to squabble different visions. Right. So I offered to buy them out. They wouldn't. So I sold out to them, and I went back to Disney, thinking it was just going to be a temporary thing. Barry Braverman hired me, thinking it would be a year or two until I got, finances back in order after owning my own company. And then I'd go off and do it again. And then 25 years later, I retired out of Disney. So that part of the plan didn't work very well. Yeah.
It was a bit different. Yeah. So, how different was the atmosphere then? Because, obviously you returned and you had, you're right in the middle of the Eisner Wells expansion. Like, how different did it feel to be at WDI versus even when you were there at, 7, 8, 9 years earlier?
Yeah, well, when I was there earlier, it was under Ron Miller. Well, first Curt Walker and then Ron Miller briefly. And it was kind of a mess, honestly. Epcot was exciting and Epcot was fun. And there were a ton of us, young kids at the time, given a lot of responsibility. And there were lots of arguments because we would argue what we didn't know anything about. and the handful of experienced people would try to wrangle us and couldn't. And but it was fun. We did a lot of great stuff. But then when the takeover attempts started, everything got very dark. They bought our Vita as a poison pill. Didn't really work. Ron Miller was, card retired. He just got the heck out of town. Ron Miller wasn't that sharp. Disney hadn't had a profitable movie in forever until he did Splash. So he did the one movie that was profitable. But I can remember doing a presentation of Tron Arcade in front of Ron and a bunch of people. A bunch of senior executives just stood in the back and looked at Playboy foldouts. It was like, just spent millions of your guys' dollars, and this is the attention I'm getting. I mean, it was just really bad. I was more than happy to leave at that time and go out on my. When I came back, of course, in the meantime, Eisner and Wells had come in, and they had just finished opening. I guess they just finished opening Studio Tour. Everybody was excited. you could sit down and talk with those guys and have, as designers, and have real conversations with them. They were fun to talk to, exciting to talk to. They were spending a lot of money. The competition with Universal had kind of kicked up something kind of dumb, actually, but it worked out great for us creatives, which was Disney had laid off a ton of people at the end of Epcot. They all started wanting work. Many of them ended up at Universal. So a lot of trained people went over to help Universal, one. The other is when Eisner Wells came in, they looked at the pricing structure of the parks. They said, well, this is weird. You've got one park or two, I guess 3 in the day, but at any rate, not very many. The demand is way above this. You can price it a lot higher, which they did. The downside of that for Disney was that it got rid of a huge barrier to entry. All of a sudden, Universal could afford to charge more because they kind of couldn't charge more than Disney did back then. And so when they were able to raise their prices, then all of a sudden they could persuade their management to do more. And so then we got into this lovely period where it was Universal versus Disney, Michael versus Jay Stein, trying to outdo the other.
That's so interesting because I feel like we're kind of in that a little bit now too, but in a different way. The money is so much bigger. But so I'd love to ask you about some of the work you did. You already referenced DisneyQuest, and I don't know if this will totally go chronologically, but we'll kind of try as best we can. But that one to me is, it was at a weird time. I didn't get to go to it much because it was like right when I was out of college and before I had kids, and I didn't go to Disney World as much. But now I kind of really kick myself because it, especially in the early years, just seems so cool. So I'd love to know about, especially given your background, your experience on that, because it's such a cool project.
There was a period where Eisner and Wells were very much wanting new businesses. They wanted to grow the company. They felt that's what they'd been charged to do. And so part of it was figuring out new businesses. And in the end, they put together something called Disney Regional Entertainment. We were in it. ESPN Zones were in it. Club Disney was in it. And they experimented with a bunch of other stuff. But for us, the idea came from 2 guys, Mike, Joe D'Annunzio and Mike, who were both ex-Harvard guys. Joe was also a Stanford guy. They'd done business consulting and, at all the big places, and they were really, really smart. And they had this idea of building in DisneyQuest and these regional entertainment things. They noted that you had to travel half a continent to get to a park if you didn't live near one, right? They were just so far apart. And they thought the idea of building a smaller set of products that were more local would be attractive. Now, they weren't the only people thinking that way. Dave and Buster's came in about that time. Chuck E. Cheese had come in a little earlier. There were a bunch of those sort of smaller scale ideas came out at the time. But at any rate, they were very excited about it, managed to sell it on to upper management. They brought in, as creatives, Larry Gertz, well, originally Jan Circus and Tom Morris, and then Larry Gertz came in, and then he brought me in, because none of them were real interactive people. And the idea for this was really a game arcade on steroids, where all the games were big games. They were big enough that you couldn't do them in your own house for sure, and you couldn't do them in the local arcade, because there were still a lot of local arcades around in those days. And so we began to put those together. And the work I had done on DisneyQuest earlier kind of qualified me for that. As a matter of fact, I called a couple of people, Bill Redmond, for instance, who'd worked with me on DisneyQuest, and said, hey, we're going to try it again. Want to join it? Sure, let's do that, because that's going to be really fun. And it was. We had a great time. We put together a bunch of attractions. We got to experiment a ton. I don't know, both DisneyQuest and Game Grid before it were probably at a certain level ahead of their times, which I'm proud of. But ahead of your time is a double-edged sword, right? The good news is you've seen into the future in a way that other people are going to eventually catch up to, but they haven't yet. The bad news is the economics often don't work. And, nobody ever gave us any grief over the creative that we did, but it didn't work as a business. And that was sad, because the original idea is that there were going to be 40 of those around.
Wow.
We did one in Orlando. We did a second one in Chicago. And when that one began to start, one just starting in Philadelphia, they pulled the plug. The one in Orlando lasted forever, way beyond. It was 20% of the product was supposed to be changed every year. So by the time it closed, it was all very antique, and nothing looks older than old computer graphics. So that was sad. But like I say, the experimentation, we wanted every platform to be different. We divided the building into what we called psychographic zones that were our equivalent of lands, but they were really focused on different audiences. So there was a kid zone, there was an explore zone, which was games where the sort of more like activities than games. There wasn't a score. There was a score zone that was about achieving a score. Probably forgetting something else. But at any rate, so we did a bunch of that, and it worked really well. It was a ton of fun. DisneyQuest in Florida worked really well. It also turned out to be one of the first places you could go, well, a few places you could go if it rained. And so it got jammed on rainy days, and that helped. It was also, they linked it to cruise ships where you'd come to the parks for a half a day or for a day, and then you'd do a half a day and then go over to the Port Canaveral. Well, that half day off in DisneyQuest was a great day for that. So they found all sorts of ways to run it. The gameplay itself, we structured it so that there were big games, Virtual Pirates of the Caribbean, which played on a boat that rocked. We got you to run around untethered on a motion base. How safety let us do that? They did.
Yeah,
And,
I'm sure it was fine.
We never hurt anybody. So yeah, Cyberspace Mountain, which was design the roller coaster of your dreams or nightmares. Get on it and ride it. If you put 13 loops in the coaster, you will go upside down 13 times, right? And later we had to put some limits on the number of times you could invert, but just because people can make themselves ill, right? And,
yes.
And we did two different things: Aladdin and Ride the Comics, which were HMD based, very early HMD based games. Not the earliest. John Snoddy's Aladdin attraction in Epcot was first. We modified that to make it work much better, work economically, really, Disney Plus. But so we did those, Alien Encounter. Yeah, there were a bunch of others. But we made some big ones, and then we made a bunch of middle-sized ones where we took existing things and themed them heavily. And then we took a lot of off-the-shelf stuff and just used it that way. So it was an arcade that scaled in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think your point about it being a little of its time, because I think now, like in my local area, we have like a VR thing where you can go. We have retro arcades. We have kind of all the different elements of Disney Quest, and they're all at different places. Or but then now it's much cheaper. You couldn't just do a pop-up one in the middle of the country like you can maybe now. So it's too bad because
we were paying $100,000 for those big computers. Each.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
And the maintenance has to be high too, right?
Oh yeah, those big silicon-graphic things. And the other thing is those computers are the size of bar fridges.
Yeah,
and your cell phone has way more power than those things had. So the world changes.
Well, it was a cool spot. It's too bad, especially because its replacement is now gone. So now they're not really sure what to do. So as far as I know, we'll see what happens over in Florida. But I want to ask you about some of the attractions you worked on in the parks, because there's a lot of really cool stuff. I know one of the early ones, Turtle Talk with Crush. I remember doing that when it was in the really little room.
Yeah, that's Seas Pavilion. My favorite. Well, my second favorite version of that. My favorite version is in Tokyo, where we got to theme the heck out of it. But my first favorite was that one, because that's where we discovered it all and invented it all, right? And that worked really well. No expectations from guests. I remember, so by this time I built a lot of stuff, including some post show for Star Trek in France, and a lot of post show stuff and some pre-show stuff. And so I kind of knew how to build those environments, which is you make a kit, which you playtest the heck out of at labs here in California. But then you take that kit to Florida and you finalize it in front of a real audience, because the thing that designers do most often is overestimate the intelligence of the audience in the field, right? I don't mean that in a rude way. It's just that audiences, the brain pays attention to that which is novel and not to that which is known. So when a person's watching TV at home, they can put 100% of their focus on the screen. When they're in a movie theater, on the screen. When they're playing a game, on the screen. But when you're out and about in the theme park, it's all around you. And so you've got many more distractions. Worse, you're probably in a family relationship that isn't standard, right? Most days, dad and mom aren't paying all their attention to the children. Most days, children aren't getting all the attention of mom and dad. And so a ton of mental cycles are starting understanding that your audience is distracted at a level that they're not in other kinds of entertainment. And so I would take these. So we took I think we'd tested 4,000 or 5,000 people at a mock-up theater we had here in California. But then we took that all down to Florida and began to develop it. And the way we would do it, we did soft opening where we would run a show where we just open the doors, collect some people, close the doors, do a play test with them, then hold them and ask them questions, then let them out. And we would advertise by saying, you want to see a preview, just agree to give us feedback. So one day, I don't know, maybe the second weekend we were play testing. And myself and Steve Spiegel, who was the head writer, and Raul Fernandez, who was creative director, and Roger Gould, who was the representative from Pixar at the time. He's now senior guy in overall animated stuff that goes in the park. But we were standing at the front. Roger was asking questions, and the rest of us were commenting or asking, answers and stuff. And one of the guests said something about, Roger asked a question, and the guest said, well, yesterday when we were here, we saw you did this, and today you did this, and we liked that better. And I was like, because when that woman said that, I saw a bunch of people's heads bounce. And it was like, and Roger was getting ready to ask the next question. I stopped him. I said, just a second. I said, how many of you have seen the show already once or more than once? And half the audience raised their hand. And I was stunned because these are people, most of them who've come a long distance to get to Epcot. Their time is valuable. They have a ton of other things on offer that they can see. And they've made a conscious choice to come back and hang around the Seas Pavilion until maybe a door opens again. I was like, this is really interesting. And I remember the four of us looking at each other. Oh, this is not bad news at all. It was a very fun moment. And so we continued to do that, and we opened the show. There had been, however, an interruption in the development. Originally, we were going to do it on a certain time frame. Pixar was going to provide all the backgrounds and the pre-animated characters, the Dory and the other characters that come in. Right? And then we'd gotten hung up, and we'd run out of money, and I had to go find more. So we'd gotten out of sync because then they started Mission Impossible. So when we only opened with this limited show, and then they came back later, added those other bits. And it worked out great for us because our actors all trained on the limited show, got really used to interacting with the audience. And then we came back about 3 months later and installed all the other stuff and got to work with the actors again and really polish them up. And before long, I remember, again, just another lovely moment. I had just arrived on an airplane, was driving in from the airport, and I passed, first a bus passed me with Crush on the side of it, and I was like, I've never had an attraction that people have marketed seriously. And then I passed a billboard for it. And it was like, okay. And the interesting thing was, it had all started out as word of mouth. Cast members had found out about it. They started telling each other, and then cast members at desks in the hotels would tell people. And that's the reason we ended up having to redo it eventually, because it's so clotted, that little room, the queue for it, so clotted, the center of the pavilion, you couldn't move around. So then the good news and bad news of that is I was at the time working on an interactive show for the Wonders of Life Pavilion, going to completely redo that. And they decided, and they were going to kill the Seas Pavilion because there had been issues. Those animals should be over in the animal kingdom anyway. Let's make this brand new Wonders of Life Pavilion, and we'll close down the Seas Pavilion. And then when Turtle Talk hit like crazy, they killed my other project
Oh.
and redid Seas Pavilion.
Wow, that's so interesting because in one sense, it's like, oh, I would have loved for Wonders of Life to get reinvigorated, but I guess you can't have both. We would have had, and I like the Seas too, so I don't know. I'm very conflicted by this info here.
Yeah, no, I wanted both. I very greedily wanted both, but the business guy said that ain't gonna work. So they made me both.
It's so interesting, yeah, because I remember seeing it in the small room, and at the time it was like 2005, early 2005, I think, and I was like, this is the most, like, I would tell people, I'm like, you don't even understand. This is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Because at the time, something interacting with you like that, even at a theme park like Disney, just did not happen. Now it's more common, but it was, and especially in a small room, it felt like it was just you. Where it got bigger, it was still cool, and it had to, I understand. But it was really on the cutting edge. And like you said, that pavilion was all of a sudden the hottest place to go in the park.
I loved that little round room. It was round room. It didn't look like a theater. People went in. They weren't quite sure what expectations to have. It was very intimate. I liked the 120 feet theater. They started packing 200 people into it because that's what the room would allow by code. And then we had to allow that. But when we built the bigger theater, we said, nope, you can't go over. The show won't hold up over 200. Later, when we took to do Monsters, Inc., that is also in a round room because it's an old Circle Vision theater.
Right.
So I like that theater too. But there, they immediately wanted it to be bigger. So we knew we were going to be 400, I think 440 is the official. So when we did that, then we knew we had to find other ways to reach guests. So that's the reason we introduced the camera systems, so that you can, the guest that's being spoken to can be picked out using cameras and be seen on the big.
So how different, beyond that, what was the experience like with Monsters, Inc.? Because I feel like you said, it's quite different because it's a lot more about them performing versus them interacting in a way.
Yeah, the jokes are all, many of the jokes are based on human interaction, but a significantly larger portion of the time is spent with them doing performance. Mm-hmm. And part of that was just we wanted, a thing that was behind all of this was that guests go to theme parks thinking of them kind of like a buffet. And they want to sample a little bit of this and a little bit of that. They want a little parade, a little dark ride, a little thrill ride, a little, float on the river, and a little movie experience. But in the markets like Disneyland and Tokyo, where there's really, really high repeat visitation rates, those things were dying. They would die in a couple of years. Because if you know the butler did it, the movie isn't as neat the second time. If you know the punchline to the joke, the comedian isn't as funny the second. And so one of the things we pitched real hard was the idea that if we built interactive, quote unquote, movies, they wouldn't age out nearly so quickly. And that has turned out to be a pretty good prediction. They have held up much better. Now, part of it is the age that we've targeted. They're younger, and younger stuff tends to hold up better. But even though they're a lot more structured than I think the average guest understands, they still feel very on point, very in the moment. And so they work that way. Turtle Talk, to jump back for just a second,
mm-hmm.
When we opened, it had, I think, an 86-page script. In film, you tend to think of a page per minute. So, and this is a 12-minute show. All right, so that's a ton of stuff. The actors can use the script literally, or they can improv off the script. Mostly what we do is we use the script to train the actors so that they know they all become method actors of the sort, right? They have to learn what are the rules for being Crush, and then the best ones are ones who can perform that instinctively and in the moment, and who are funny in the moment. Monsters, Inc. is in many ways similar in that it has two performers instead of one, and what you can functionally think of as four screens, because there's the two screens that have triggered. Those are branching and can be called up as branches, but they're pre-made snippets of film, right? And the raw stuff and the mic stuff on one side, other side. So those aren't as spontaneous. In all of those, we had to invent the whole system. We use software called Touch Designer to play it, but we had to invent all the vocal system, the mouth moving systems, the vocal recognition systems, and all the animation. What gets animated in what way? What gets triggered? There's certain of the animations are calculated and animated in real time. Certain are calculated in advance but animated in real time. Then other stuff is just completely done. And how you marry all that, the controls and stuff, we had to invent all of that. So there was a huge amount of creative invention for the story and all of that. And there was a huge amount of technical invention. And part of what I loved about that was I've always liked kind of walking around on both sides of that boundary, finding the art that comes out of discovering the opportunities that are on both sides of that.
Yeah, I mean, you think of all the different pieces, like with Turtle Talk, and then adding in the improv actor who can make any single show be different. Mm-hmm. It's the repeatability, especially when it was new, but even now it's still, I think it still draws well. It
does. It draws very well. Now, will the technology remain the same as, from the very beginning, you'd get two reactions. Children who sort of think this is the world as it's supposed to be, right? They talk to their toys and they talk to cartoon characters on TV all the time. And most of the time, their parents can't see it. And it must subtly piss them off, right? but here the world is right. The cartoon characters talk to me. They're my stars. They're my movie stars, and they talk to me. But the parents instantly are looking around. How are they doing that? They're trying to figure it out. And we would get endless letters about the AI 20 years ago, well before it could even be considered. At some point, I assume lots of this kind of entertainment will be done by AI, though, lots of creatives that I work with still argue about that. There are issues like comic timing, malapropisms, comic misunderstanding. A lot of that stuff is going to be in the more difficult areas to train computer intelligence to handle, kind of the belief that in the long run we will all be serving silicon masters anyway. But what's his name said, the future's already here, it's just not very evenly distributed, one of the science fiction writers. And we're kind of there, right? The artificial intelligence will come in bit by bit, and some places it's already here and very efficient in other places. It's still stupid as a brick, and it'll take a while.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure and just maybe jump through a few other attractions here. Briefly, I want to ask you about Toy Story Mania, just because I know we have plenty of every amusement park has some sort of you shoot at a target and get points, but this one, with it being interactive and 3D and not a physical target, I'm curious, with that being, given your experience with like DisneyQuest and everything, this almost feels like a DisneyQuest type of game that got moved into a full attraction.
Yeah, I want to be a little careful about this one. So the original concept is Kevin Rafferty and Robert Coltrane, and they're brilliant and done all sorts of great stuff. Right? They came to me looking when it was going to be interactive, and I staffed it with two great people, Sue Bryan, and then a little bit later when they decided they were going to do a second track at the same time, Steph Harbuck. And they were the line producers for it, and they are the ones who did the bulk of the heavy lifting. By that point in my career, I was an executive producer, and so I was managing a bunch of different things, and my main contribution to that was making sure it was budgeted properly and getting shell games on. I won't go into the tricks because there's a lot of business organizational crap.
Right.
But my main contribution to that thing was getting it properly staffed. Now, they were very nice and had me come do reviews periodically, but mostly they knew all of it and did it. I was very pleased with it, no question, and I put it on my resume, but it's really more theirs than.
No, that's good to know. Well, I'll jump on then to one. I just talked to Trevor Bryant, who had mentioned your name a few times, about Test Track 2.0. Or the redo of that. Right. And I'm unsure how closely that's a similar era, so I don't know how closely you were involved, but anything your experience there, would love to hear about it.
with all of these, not so much because Robert and Kevin had already, everything else I tended to be this prime salesman for. At that point in my career, I was doing a ton of work very closely with attractions marketing in Florida, the marketing people in Florida, trying to sell all the Innoventions attractions and that re-sponsorship, re-upping GM for Test Track. And so I was heavily involved in the early concept work for that, all the development of that, what the post-show was going to be, what the attractions in the post-show was going to be, what the pre-show was going to be. I was on the team that was working on the next-gen band, the Magic Band. And see, that was the first attraction to use it. And we were really pushing for all of that. The car design experience at the beginning, that was all pretty much me figuring that all out. And again, part of that was trying to make sure we were meeting the goals for Magic Band. The goal for Magic Band originally was to try to make it really hard for guests to make up their mind. Do I do the standby queue because it's got a bunch of stuff that's cool in it that I can't otherwise do? Or do I do Fast Pass because it's quicker to the main attraction? And I thought we did an excellent job of making guests really confused about, do I want to do the design experience or blow by the design experience and just do the work? The downside of that was people were furious because they felt like they'd been gypped out of something if they did the Fast Pass. That made me feel good because it meant the design experience was that rewarding. And so that worked very well. Now, again, I was executive producer. Trevor was the line producer for that, and he did an excellent job with that. We got a little tangled up with dates at the end, which wasn't great. But the experience, I thought we made the pavilion feel really big, which it had kind of lost, right? By having so many things in the post-show, by having such a robust pre-show, it felt like a really big World's Fair pavilion, which a lot of Epcot stuff had kind of lost over the years. So I felt very good about the scale of it, and I felt very good about the things that we put in it. There were some maintenance issues trying to get them all up and running.
I think it turned out great. And I think your point is good about World's Fair because World of Motion, the one that used to be there, the post show had so much that felt like the most like I've never been to World's Fair, but that felt the most like what I think like a 64 World's Fair pavilion would be like.
Yes.
And I recently went and, sometimes we would do, well, now Lightning Lane, but we would skip it. But we actually did the whole standby and because it wasn't a bad wait the last time I went. And you're right, though, like there you go through and there's all the videos. And at the end, my daughter was into like making her car do the commercial and do all that, which I usually just a lot of times have not done. And we spent a while in there. And so I know they're changing it now. So I hope they retain that, too, in the future.
Yeah. So it's been, those deals are finite deals with the sponsorships. And so it's timed out and they're going to, new marketing people will have new ideas for what should be done. And so it's time for it to change it. I'm not involved, so I don't know.
Oh, right. No, I only mentioned that just because I think people still like it's still super popular. So this is a case, like you said, with sponsorships, but it's held its popularity for an interactive attraction to hold up that well, even in 10 plus years is great. Well, I know we're winding down here, but you worked on so many other projects, and I'm curious if there's one we haven't talked about, or even an experience that that really stands out, or something else you want to mention that was a cool project, because I know we haven't talked about a lot of them.
Sure. Well, I'll talk just for a minute about Innoventions. When I took over Innoventions, Tom Fitzgerald said, I want you to make Innoventions kind of DisneyQuest of Epcot, because he liked DisneyQuest. And when I took over, it got very low ratings and very low guest penetration. And when I left, its ratings were up with all but the two top attractions, and we got the same number of guests. And we did that by making it all interactive stuff. And seriously, I loved the work because I got to do it. I turned it into my own little R&D facility. I discovered that Disney didn't care that much if I used sponsors' money to do an experiment. And so, Where's the Fire? I took Lanny Smoot had come up with this idea of a flashlight that could be beam that could be tracked, and so I took that and we turned that into a story. I wanted to do something with batteries. This was before the revolution, the modern it was just ahead of that. But so we did the Don't Waste It, where we pushed around a little trash truck that recharged every time you put it back in its station. We wanted to do something with manufacturing, so we did injection molding for the plastic figures. And I had meant all of that stuff to eventually be tools that could be used elsewhere in Disney in bigger ways. In the end, I don't know that any of them really did, but the knowledge base that came out of that was reused.
Well, excellent. Well, I just have one last question for you. I mean, I know you've seen interactivity change so much during your career and even the attraction we talked about. Are there things right now that excite you or that interest you about, it doesn't just have to be theme parks, but about kind of this type of interactivity, like where it's going?
Yeah, well, because, I didn't mention my training is, or maybe my training is sculptor, and I like the dimensional world. And so to me, AI is fascinating, but what makes it really interesting is when you hook it to a machine and call it a robot. And so I think robotics are the next level of everything, right? Because all of a sudden they're going to be machines that can safely do all sorts of stuff they can't do right now. A self-driving car is a robot that you ride in, right? I remember with GM, the first self-driving car I ever rode in was 15 years ago at their place, right? They would talk about things like training, where once you've got a whole fleet of cars on the freeway together that are driving themselves, they can pull within an inch of each other and move like a train down the highway. And so all of a sudden you don't have to make the highways as big, right? And because they're all slipstreaming each other, they're more efficient in their use of energy. And I think one of the things I loved about all the work I did at Disney, particularly the work I did with sponsors, is we all hear about all the things that go wrong in the world every day. We watch the news, we read the papers, podcasts, whatever, right? What I like about the idea of a World's Fair, what I loved about Epcot and working on Epcot and working on museum work when I worked on museum, because I did a lot, was you see what smart people are doing to solve all those problems. And you get sort of an insider's peek before everything else comes on. And I just wish the world could see how many smart people are doing how many interesting things that don't involve stuff.
Great. Yeah, I'm right with you. That's one of the reasons I loved even Epcot when I was growing up, and still am interested in a lot of those types of attractions. Well, thank you so much, Joe. This has been excellent. I really appreciate it. It was so awesome to talk with you here on the podcast.
Oh, happy to do it. And, good luck and break a leg. And I hope you interview all sorts of wonderful, wonderful people.
Just wanted to give a big thanks to Joe for that interview. It was really fun to learn so much more about his career and those attractions. If you'd like to check out some past episodes, there's 234 of them, including recent conversations with Trevor Bryant about Test Track 2.0 and Ron Fish about the music for DisneyQuest. So both connections to this interview with Joe Garlington. You can find those wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever, or by going to tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end. While you're listening to these shows, definitely leave a 5-star rating or review. Really helps. Thank you so much to all of you for just being awesome people and listening to this show. Also, if you'd like to support the show, you can do so through Patreon. Get access to some really cool perks, including bonus episodes, patreon.com/tomorrowsociety, or make a one-time contribution and buy me a Dole Whip. Go to tomorrowsociety.com/Dole Whip to learn more. If you want to get a hold of me, send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or look me up on any social media, basically Threads, Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram. I'm out there wherever you typically are. You can find me, just search for Tomorrow Society and check out the Tomorrow Society channel on YouTube. The music you're hearing right now was written by Adam Hunke and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Thank you so much for listening to this interview with Joe Garlington. I hope you're all doing awesome out there and having a great summer and staying cool. It's very hot here in St. Louis. Hope you're all doing okay out there and finding ways to really enjoy the summer and get out to some parties too. Take care. Talk to you again next time.